Ernie, I love Ian Matthews' voice. I can remember the song Woodstock, of course, great Joni Mitchell song, and Joni did a beautiful job with it. Crosby, Stills, Nash. But when Ian Matthews and Matthews Southern Comfort, when they sang Woodstock, they really captured that reflective, that peace and love feel. And I am looking at Second Spring, Matthews Southern Comfort, and I bet you there is a great backstory that you're going to tell us.
Well, I hope so, and I agree with everything that you're saying. I mean, it was one of those groups that came one time and never came back, and it's interesting because I too was a huge fan of Fairport Convention and Ian Matthews. I loved his voice. And you're right, the Woodstock cover was really, really great. And I think it's because, Joni Mitchell and some of the other bands at Crosby, Stills, and Nash, they had less of a country, smooth kind of rock thing that they could bring to it. And, Ian Matthews was really all about that. I never got a chance to meet him. And the way I ended up doing this album was basically going back to Jesus Christ Superstar, winning that account for the agency that I was working with Decca Records, and their creative director, a guy named Bill Levy, who became my mentor. He took me under his wing and taught me the music. He taught me the record business. He'd been a seasoned pro there at Decca. He was at a couple other companies before then. He was a great photographer and a really good creative director. He knew how to bring out the best in the people that he worked with. And so after Jesus Christ Superstar, we became really good friends. We socialized together. We worked together. Decca Records became basically my account with Levit and Associates. Norman Levit was the agency that I was working at then. And so I pretty much spent a lot of my time hanging out with Bill, and he would, after Jesus Christ Superstar, he really started getting us more involved. There's an Edwin Starr album that I did. There was a Aida opera that I did for him. And, we had a really great relationship where he was teaching me how to be a creative director. I was never a creative director before. I was kind of a designer that hopped over a bunch of grades to get to what was a creative director. I couldn't even tell you what it was. I didn't know the difference between a designer or a senior designer and a creative director and a senior creative director. All these titles were confusing to me. I just did what I normally do. And so when the Ian Matthews cover came up, he called me into his office, and I already knew Ian Matthews, and I knew of Fairport Convention, which he was the lead singer in, and I loved their music. And he showed me this image on the left here. Is that my left? No, that's my right. The image on my right was a cover that Ian Matthews had designed, and it was a UK release, for Second Spring, and the record company didn't really like it. They thought it was pretty weak, and they wanted something more with a little more punch to it. But, I didn't have any photography. I didn't have anything to look at but this cover that Ian had done. And, being aware of his voice, his music, and the feel that he tried to there. I mean, it's kind of like a Currier and Ives black. It's like one color. Most Currier and Ives prints were color, but very much in the style of that illustration. So I understood where he was coming from when he designed that cover. And I wanted to do something really different, but yet the same, so he would be comfortable with it. I didn't want to take what he had done and bastardize it and, make it not what his band and he reflected. I mean, one of the things that I really tried to do that I think made a big difference was I was familiar with the music, not only his, but all these bands. Maybe it was a band that I didn't even know about, like Flaming Embers or Ruth Copeland. These were covers. I didn't know their music. The Honeycomb, I didn't know their music, but before I started working on them, I found their music, and there was no internet then, so it wasn't that easy. Spent a lot of time in record stores talking with friends that maybe had the music, maybe not. And, there wasn't even cassettes then. This is like 1970. that I did this cover, and it was right before I made the transition to the Stones Tongue and coming, working for that company and coming back out to California and all that. So this was kind of like a stepping stone in that direction, although I didn't know it was going to go that way. It's always a great surprise when things work out that you never expect. I'm sure you know about that, I mean.
And you wish they could always be that way.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't it? I mean, so I wanted to do something, and it wasn't about a budget. It was more about there was nothing to work with. We had that covered. We didn't even have a photograph of it. So I was really into rendering. I had a bunch of really good rendering classes in college, and I did some really nice renderings of artichokes and feathers and pieces of wood, driftwood and stuff, all assignments. But I really had the ability to do that. And it's a hard thing to do. I mean, making something look like what it looks like in real life in a painting is really hard to do. So I decided that the best way to approach this would, if I had, and there wasn't really any Getty images or anything like that, there wasn't really a lot of stock photography. You usually went out and took a picture and used that, and there was a time element here with this too. So I rendered, the background is a piece of wood that I rendered, and then we talked about it a time or two ago about how type fonts were very limited, and you didn't really have the ability to do custom stuff. So this is one of those times when I realized that, hey, I could probably do some lettering that would look like this. And I kind of tried to emulate what he had done with the oval and, the type and, just the way everything kind of read. And so I did the rendering separate, and then I did the lettering, and we put the two together in the film and printing. And I found a print, a Currier and Ives print. We did have, trying to remember the name of it. It was like a standard book of images that you could get. And it was, God, I can never remember the name of it, but it was like a necessity. You really had to have that, but it was very limited. So Currier and Ives, very popular European, illustrations. I found a really nice one that I put inside the oval and try to make it feel like if it were on the side of a barn, with the wormwood, and it's got that kind of slow country feeling to it. And like I said, working with Bill was really great because he wasn't judgmental. He was more helpful than anything else. Even though he was the boss, he was the creative director. He really liked what I did, and he liked working with me. We really had a great chemistry between us, and we stayed friends for quite a while after we started Pacific Pioneer. And then I lost track of him, and maybe 15 years later, I get a call from him. He's living in Arizona, and he comes through Palm Desert and Palm Springs to go to some friends he had in Northern California. So he and his wife stopped by, and we had dinner together. It was great catching up with him. He had all this really fantastic photography because he was also a photographer. Besides being the creative director at Decca Records, he would go to all the concerts and be right there in front, taking pictures of everybody. He had all this library of live performances backstage. I mean, really great stuff. But he didn't really know how to go about marketing it. How do I sell it? Because now it's 15 years later, times have changed, and he kind of felt like, I think he felt like he was a fish out of water in the sense that he wasn't a creative director anymore. When you're a creative director, when you're the boss, you get, really, really a lot of attention paid to you by the people that are giving you work. And a lot of it was just superficial, just trying to get the work. But we had really been able to form a great relationship, a personal relationship, because we socialized and he loved to party, and him and his secretary, Claudia. And so they'd come over we had an apartment in Park Slope near the Brooklyn Museum. He lived in Sutton Place in Manhattan. And so he and his secretary would come over and we'd party and hang out, and it was a great time that I had with him. And in fact, when I left to go to Craig Braun's, Craig was sort of hoping that I would bring that client with me, and I didn't want to, it was wrong to do that. because he wasn't like that. You know, he stayed true to Decca. You cut him and he bled Decca rainbow color. You know, I mean, the guy was just a total devoted, you know, piece of that company. So, you know, when I went to Craig's, quite honestly, he didn't really like Craig. Tony, Craig's vice president, who became my partner, we used to call on him and try and get appointments with him. And it was like, Bill was smart. Bill realized right away that Tony and Craig were the kind of people that would want to just get everything they could from you, they could get. And when they were done with you, you were yesterday's news. You know, and Tony wasn't so much like that, but Craig was. That was what he was all about. He would use people for as much as he could get and then move to the next person. And that's one of the reasons why both of us, you know, decided to start Pacific Eye and Ear. Instead of going to work for somebody else, like we were talking to do, it was always going to end up like that. There was always going to be a person like that somewhere near the top, above you, that would be a constant battle. So we just sort of decided to stay away from it and start Pacific Eye and Ear. And when I did the cover illustration and the lettering, Bill really loved it. And we needed something for the inside sleeve. So what you see over here, and I only had a little piece I have all this stuff in storage up in my shed where I have everything. There's thousands of pieces. And to try and dig it all out and take a picture of it. So I went online and I found this much of a picture of the sleeve that behind the back cover, right? And so what I did was I knew what he looked like because there was photography from before, other things that he had done. We just didn't have anything current. So what I did was an illustration of him in a sepia tone to sort of match the feeling of the wood and stuff. I mean, and according to Bill, he really, really liked it. You know, he felt that it was everything that he would approve without any problem, without any reservation. It wasn't that far away from what he had tried to do or what he had done for the UK release. And it was it actually, I think, you know, there was more to it, you know, and it set more of the mood. Like him and his bands, whether it was Fairport Convention or Matthews Southern Comfort, were very real. I mean, they stayed true to their music. They didn't vary from it. And I think that he saw the same thing in what I tried to do with taking his concept and taking it in a little bit more, it wasn't a different direction. It was just a little more finished than his. And I think that's probably why Decca felt that it wouldn't really sell here in the US. It just wasn't really the right look. And quite honestly, having both those covers, and they're both called Second Spring, and they're both with the same exact music, you know, it became very confusing. And I think that was part of the problem with people finding out, you know, that it was the same album. I mean, even when you try and Google it, the one that he did comes up first, and you got to really search for this one. And then when you find this one, that one kind of goes away. And so, you know, you think it's two different albums. But again, I think that the powers that be at Decca felt that it just wouldn't sell in the American market. And I guess the album did pretty well. I mean, again, this was one of those that sort of came and went. You know, I never got a chance to meet him. I only heard back his reaction from Bill Levy because Bill had conversations with him because he was a creative director at Decca. And so, you know, he was able to get calls and get his input. And that was really kind of nice to hear. It's always nice to hear that the people that you do the work for like it.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad.
And the label really liked it too. You know, like I said, the powers that be at Decca felt that it was a much better version of, you know, his music and representation of his music. And then on the back cover, I just used the illustration of the wood, put type over it. You know, it was a really quick we didn't have a whole lot of time. I think I probably did the whole thing in about a week. You know, I mean, with the renderings and the lettering. And the lettering, you know, I was still kind of struggling with the lettering because there were no rapidograph pens. the kind that would have a cartridge and it had ink in it. You could shake it and it would, yeah, work. This was mainly done with ruling pens and old school brushes and stuff, and India ink. You know, it was always done in black, and then you could separate it and put it in any color you wanted. But you know, it wasn't that easy to make sure that the letter spacing was right, that the curve was right. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that letter, even though it looks pretty simple. You know, there's a lot that goes into it, and it couldn't be funky. I started thinking at first, well, maybe I'll make it look funky because I could do it faster, you know. But I started one that kind of looked like it was weathered, you know, with irregular edges and stuff, not real clean. But it looked funky because the wood already had that feel to it, and I wanted it to jump out more than looking like it was on the side of a weathered barn door, you know, or something. So we kept it sharp, and I ended up doing the whole thing with a tighter, you know, version rather than the weathered look. And I think it works really nice. Otherwise it gets too lost. If you know, sometimes the name of the band and the title of the album becomes secondary to the image and the craziness that's going on in the cover. And you know, one of the things that I did agree with record companies was the name. If they weren't really well known, where the Beatles put out a white album and it didn't matter, you know, the name needed to be pretty prominent. The title could be secondary to it, but the name, you needed to, as you're going through those record racks in the stores, you know, it had to be in that top third. Later on, when we went out into Pacific Pioneer, you'll look at a lot of the covers we did, and it was like that. We always tried to keep that on the top, but sometimes we didn't. Sometimes, you know, we kind of downplayed it, but that was with groups that really knew that, you know, that were really hot and the industry really knew. So you know, for this, I learned a lot. You know, with trying to, like I said, I wasn't really at this point. I had been doing album covers for, well, just concentrating on album covers. Beside Dolls Alive, there had only been 2 or 3 covers, Jesus Christ Superstar, and 2 or 3 covers after that I worked with Bill on. And then I was sent out to LA to open the satellite office, and we still stayed in touch. In fact, this is really kind of a funny story. There was a machine called a Lucograph. And what it was if you could put an image on a flat piece, it was like a camera on a rail, and you could put an image there and you could make it bigger or smaller, you know, by cranking it forward or cranking it backward. And it wouldn't make a print, but what it did do was it would project whatever you had put on the other end onto the board that you were drawing on. And we used it a lot. Drew used it, Bill used it, we all used it, because, you know, the only other option is to get a stat, you know, make a print and all that stuff, and it gets expensive. We had a Lucograph that was I would say it was about a $5,000 Lucograph that was given to us by Bill Levy, because what had happened, and this is really great, we stayed in touch, like I said. We didn't really get much work from him. I think we did a couple things, but we stayed in touch and we were still good friends. And Decca Records had moved. And before they moved, Bill ordered this big Lucograph because they had an art department internally, and it was a piece of equipment that you wanted to have. It saved a lot of money, saved a lot of time, and especially for illustrators. You know, they could do a sketch and then project that sketch up onto a board that they were going to do the illustration on, instead of trying to redraw it from a sketch onto the actual finished piece that was going to be the finished piece. They could just project it and it would be exactly, they could do it with a photograph, you could do it with a sketch. So it really became a valuable tool. And when they moved, there was no room in the new space that they moved to put this Lucograph, because it wasn't small, it was big.
And I was going to ask you because I've never seen that, and wanted to know if there was an image online about, you know, the Lucograph.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, they were a necessity for art departments, no matter whether you were in the record business or not. It gave you, and like I said, it didn't make a print, but it projected. It was like an opaque projector. Okay. And then this one was so cool that it had the projection coming from the lens through this piece that projected it down. You could turn it and you could project it on a wall.
Oh, that's neat. That
Yeah, and
is
so
really
you could.
neat.
Yeah, I mean, it was very cool. So he said, you know, I have this Lucy graph. I can't really use it. Would you guys like it? And I said, are you kidding? Of course we'd like it. You know, we didn't have anything like that. We were kind of drawing and then redrawing bigger, and it became a real hassle because you couldn't make any mistakes and erase stuff on the surface that you were going to be doing the art on. So you tried to do it as perfect as you could. And so he never unpacked it. He just had it shipped from them to us. And it must, I mean, in those days, it had to have cost $1,000 or $2 to ship it. It was a big piece of equipment. And so we got it. It was amazing. We had a room to put it in. It worked out perfect. And so Bill, we became very good friends, like I said. And then as life always does, you end up going different directions. And we lost touch with each other for quite a while. And then, like I said, when, we were here in the desert, and I think I was with my second company, David Hale, that we started, me and another guy that worked for me at Pacific Pioneer. And he reached out to me, and it was so great hearing from him. And I tried to help him with, people that he could talk to about using his photography and how he could market it and stuff. Because by that time I was already doing it with my art, the art that I have, from Pacific Pioneer and the stuff that I had done. I was already out there kind of doing stuff with it. And so I gave him, some pointers, and it was really funny. Then I heard, I don't know, I guess it had to be 5 or 6 years ago, I heard that he had passed away. I talked to his wife. She called me, and it was really sad. I mean, I really miss him. He was a great mentor. In my life, I've had, Sister Mary Lucity, my parents, Mr. Briggs, who was in my high school guy, and a couple other, there was, what was her name? Oh gosh, there was this older woman who was in charge of people that would call the school that needed art done. And she would always recommend me first. So I would get all these like freelance jobs from her. And for the life of me, I can't remember her name right this minute. But I've had people like that pretty much my whole life. And people like you, people like other people that I've worked with. Bob, my guy who does all my finishing, we're like an old married couple. We've been together since 1984, and he's just awesome. And he has not just art skills that he has to offer to our relationship, but he had a company that he built from himself and his wife to about 40 or 50 people, and then just got really, well, he got on the radar of the bigger companies, post-production companies in the movie and video business. And, that's really bad because they'll either put you out of business or buy you, and he didn't want either. And he decided that it was all just too crazy. And some of the employees were stealing stuff. And, when you have all that equipment and stuff, it's hard.
Yeah.
And you can't be there 24/7. So, I remember I had a couple guys that worked for me at Pacific Pioneer. One of them was a junior designer. The other one was a production artist. And we were working, and everything was kind of cool. And the person that was in charge of the supplies, making sure that we always had enough rubber cement and rubber cement thinner and illustration board and pencils and pens and ink, came to me a couple times and said, hey, we ordered all this stuff, and now it's kind of it's diminishing, and we need to reorder it. We couldn't figure out what was going on.
Oh,
well,
no.
one night, it was about, I don't know, 12 o'clock in the evening, and I needed to go back to the office. So I went back, and here's these two guys, and they're running a business.
Oh,
They're
that's
running
awful.
a design business out of my office in the middle of the night. So they come in, 10, 11 o'clock and work till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then go back home and then come in like they were working at Pacific Pioneer. It was really weird. And these are two guys that I really liked. I trusted. They had been with me for months, and I didn't know that they kind of knew each other, but one did recommend the other one. Well, I hired one for the production artist, and then he recommended, well, I work with this young designer. He's really good, and we could use the help. We're doing a lot of stuff. So I hired him. And again, I didn't know that they had their own little business on the side. So, I was small. Pacific Pioneer never got bigger than 11 people. and I wanted it that way. Reminded me, I always compare Pacific Pioneer to like rock bands, and in that analogy, it would be Nirvana. You know, Kurt Cobain and the group never wanted to be a huge band. They didn't want it. And then all of a sudden they became huge and they couldn't deal with it. You know, we always stayed small. We never had any aspirations to be big. And the bigger it got, the worse it got. All these politics and egos and people coming with sob stories. And, you know, this guy said that. And, you know, it just gets to be too much. So, you know, again, you know, and at that same time, my partner and I, Tony, were kind of at odds with each other. Pacific Pioneer was failing. You know, we're not making the kind of money that we needed to make to sustain the company. Luckily, we had moved the company from a big office into a fourplex that we bought, and we took 1 2-bedroom apartment out of the 4 and converted it over to an office. And we moved our whole facility in there. It was great. You know, it worked out really well for a few years, but then, you know, he and I were getting further and further apart. And it was sad. It was like, you know, it's like any group, you know, you had such great highs and such great camaraderie. And then all of a sudden, it's not the same anymore, and it only gets worse. So you can understand a lot of times how bands kind of split up. They go their own ways. There's so much, you know, animosity or egos or money. You know, I mean, Burton Cummings once told me that the biggest thing that breaks groups up is the money. The fact that they have a hit single, the writer keeps getting paid, but the musicians don't. So there's all this, you know, built up hatred. It starts out uneasiness and it ends up being hatred toward the one that's getting paid. You know, Flo and Eddie, the Turtles, great friends, love those guys. They didn't write Happy Together. And it became their theme song, but they didn't write it. So every time they, you know, recorded it or whatever, the guy who wrote it got paid, not them. So, you know, but they were cool with it. I mean, they were understanding and stuff, but sometimes it really gets on people's, you know, under their skin, you know, and I guess Pacific Pioneer toward the end, you know, I would say the last year and a half, it was not good, you know, and, you know, even though I didn't want to, we had to end it, you know, and it got kind of ugly because we were partners in the fourplex. So when he moved out, you know, we sort of took control of everything. And so he was kind of left out of everything, and we sort of forced it to a head because otherwise it would have just gone on, you know, and it was really bad. And I remember, you know, we were in my lawyer's office. And,
Ernie, we have 2 minutes, my dear. I says, I
okay.
don't want to, I'm
okay.
so sorry.
Anyway, we'll talk about all that at another time.
Any
Thank
songs,
you for the heads up.
any songs that you want from Matthew Southern Comfort?
Okay, well, I'm going to pick some songs right now, you know, and for me, the Darcy Farrow.
Oh, that's great.
Was a song that I always loved, and the second one was Blood Red Roses. So both those songs for me would be the ones that I would play, either or, whatever you decide as well. But you know, there's so many songs to choose from, and especially on this album, there's a lot of really good songs. So, you know, those would be the two that I would choose.
You've made excellent choices. And
Yep.
Just a great band, and you really captured what they were about, especially on this album cover and what Ian's vision was, because I've been doing a lot of reading. And
yeah, he was very much that, you know, and I, again, all I had was a bio that the record company had written, you know, so that, and listening to his music with Fairport Convention, you know, and then I think this was the second album that he did as Matthew Southern Comfort. And so I wasn't that familiar, although the music wasn't that different. You know, it was for me, it's always been the voice. Yeah, there's great guitarists and great drummers and all the rest of it, but for me, it's the voice. That's why Burton, that's why Alice, that's why I'm always leaning toward the vocals, you know. So that's just how it is.
It's just a beautiful design. It's always a joy having you on the blog.
Well, thank you, Joyce. I really appreciate it. I really do. And we have some great neighbors, you know, here, and I love being here with you every week, and I love your show. It's great. I learn a lot. You know, it's really amazing how well you educate your listeners, and that's why you're as popular as you are. and thank you for making it possible for me too. So I love
Sure.
you and I love our neighbors, and you just take care, and I'll see you next week.